Erich Traub, he was like probably the most skilled bioweaponeer on the planet. That's why every country wanted him. But he basically advised us on how to run a biological warfare program. So all of our biodefense practices actually come from the Nazis. Basically we were advised by Nazis like Erich Traub, among others, on how to run. That's where we got that whole simulant testing idea from. They were doing the simulant testing since the 1930s. German intelligence, they were going into the subways of Paris and London, and they would release these bacteria called Serratia marcescens that was supposed to be harmless. But in my book, I showed how Erich Traub had actually weaponized that bacteria in 1940 with a virus. What he did was, so Serratia marcescens, given that it's considered harmless, they often use it.
I had an amazing conversation with Adam Finnegan, and I think you're going to really enjoy this one as well. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell so you never miss an episode, and please leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help our little Ohana grow, and it helps new listeners find the show. I also want to say mahalo to everyone who leaves positive comments on YouTube. I truly do appreciate all of you who takes the time to share your thoughts and your insights. So mahalo, guys, for that. And if you'd like even more content, don't forget to check out the Wyola Plus community on Patreon. We also have membership options here on YouTube. Now, today I'm sitting with Adam Finnegan, author of Sleeper Agent. We discuss Lyme disease, chronic illness, biological warfare, and some of the controversial questions surrounding disease and public health. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please be sure to check out Adam's book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm sure you will too. I'll put the link in the show notes below. Now, let's bring Adam into this conversation. Enjoy the show. Aloha, Adam, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed reading your book, The Sleeper Agent. What struck me most was that it wasn't simply a book about Lyme disease, but it explored chronic illness, biological warfare, intelligent operation, and some very controversial questions surrounding public health and disease. Now, before we get started, I do want to mention that there's a few topics in your book that we can't get into on the YouTube side, particularly the discussions around vaccines and the conclusion you draw throughout the book with that. But I'd love to save that topic for the Wyola Plus side, where we can have a more open conversation there. And for the YouTube audience, I'd like you to focus on your personal journey, your Lyme disease, the chronic illness, and immune intolerance, and the research that led you to write this book. So, Adam, before we get into your research, can you take us back to 2016 and tell us what happened that set you on this path?
Well, I'd probably even go back further because first off, my mother got Lyme disease in the early 2000s. So I was familiar with it by that time. And we had somebody on my home in my hometown. I grew up in Grafton, Massachusetts, which is right next to Worcester, Massachusetts, where somebody had Lyme disease on our in our neighborhood, and so I had heard it from that when I was growing up. I didn't really know too much about it, but when my mother got it, I pretty much learned a lot more about it. Then it was about 2004, no, 2006, my fault, when I came across a book. So I always liked reading about things like biological warfare and dangerous diseases. I always liked reading about stuff like that.
Wow.
So I was in a library once, and I came across the book Lab 257, which is the book about Plum Island, written by Michael Christopher Carroll. And that's the first book that he talks about. That's the first book that talks about Erich Traub. Well, actually, Linda Hunt's book about Operation Paperclip, but it was Michael Carroll who really kind of got Erich Traub's name more well known. Um, and I read that book, and it was very influential on me. Then in 2016, I got bit by a tick and got sick. Um, I went in to get help and they told me I had viral labyrinthitis and it didn't make sense. They said, "Oh, you'll be better in a few weeks," but that never happened. Then the more I went in to get help, the more they'd send me in circles to different specialists and no one had any answers. And then eventually I saw a Lyme literate doctor who gave me a different test and concluded that I did have Lyme disease, mycoplasma, and reactivated viruses. So, and I had suspected that it probably was that, considering that my mother had it and everything, and that confirmed it. And it was, I had joined this Facebook group about how Lyme disease works by this woman, a former Pfizer biochemist named Kathleen Dixon. It was called Truth Cures, and she was also helping her were Laura Hovind, who now runs it. Kathleen doesn't even have anything to do with it anymore. Laura runs it, and basically, I learned what this whole immune tolerance thing is. Immune tolerance, it's confusing for people who hear the term because it's a vague term. You can think of it as chronic immunosuppression or chronic immune deficiency because basically what it is your immune system is forced into a state where you're tolerating harmful pathogens that you should otherwise be keeping out of you. And that's not a good thing because when your immune system can't fight back, then that allows this kind of like central nervous system invasion, also an invasion of your organs and your inner body. Like you got to think of it like this: inflammation, right, on the outside of you. It's like trying to keep the bugs from getting into you and integrating into your organs and your brain and everything. So it's, you see inflammation, it's trying to keep that out of you. And once I figured how this works, I had decided at one point, all right, I want to figure out this Lyme disease biowarfare connection because John Loftus, the one who wrote the introduction of my book, he was the source for Michael Christopher Carroll in Lab 257 about Erich Traub. And he was saying in his book, The Belarus Secret, which is now republished as America's Nazi Secret, was that Lyme disease was the result of biological warfare activity gone awry. And so I reached out to him. I put this timeline together and everything. Um, and he thought it was brilliant. He introduced me to a very high level biodefense source who was the original source for that claim. He also introduced me to two screenwriters, one of which is fairly well known in Hollywood circles, Jodie Savin. She wrote, that book about the genie Sinbad played. Um, I forget what it's called, but she also worked on SNL. Well, they were writing a screenplay about this whole thing, and they basically said, "Will you research for us as you're writing your book, and tell us what you find?" And so it was kind of like this mutual agreement. I was helping them as I was writing my book, and they paid for a lot of the documents that I got, and I had to pay for all of Eric Traub's research. So to back up a little bit, when I got sick, it was very weird. It was like I had chronic headaches that never go away. I still have them, and my forehead and my head is like all numb and tingly. You get used to it, but it's definitely not something that's fun. And sometimes it's worse than others. Like sometimes it just completely lays you out and you have to lay down and you know, then there's the joint pain, body aches, and just feeling like you've been poisoned. And So that, I mean, I think I was like probably a lot sicker back then, but I had some force within me that was just driving me to write this book. And I mean, there were days when I would spend like 12 hours a day just looking at a computer, going through all the documents to the point where it felt like my eyes were gonna pop out of my skull because the screen just, oh, looking at a screen all day. But I also like, so you see some of the three ring binders back here. I also put together those, and that kind of helped minimize all the screen time, was just looking at papers instead. So I kind of was back and forth, but it was something that it was a life work that if I had not got sick, I don't think I would have done it. And at one point, I didn't even like, I don't even like science. I'm not even that interested in science, except that when I did this, one of the women who I had met through that group, Truth Cures, was I was very friendly with her at the time, and she's like, "You really got to go learn the science." And I was like, "Oh, I don't really want to, but and I did, and I'm glad I did because if I didn't, I wouldn't have understood Erich Traub's work, and he was like an evil genius. He was very intelligent. Um, and he was very subtle about because he doesn't publish in his open literature that he's making weapons or anything like that. Like you have to kind of like make analogies by reading his papers and saying, okay, how could this be used in a dual use capacity for good or for harm? Um, so that was kind of like I had to find every single citation and collect every single paper that he ever made along with all of his colleagues.
Well, for listeners who don't understand what Lyme disease is, could you explain what that is and some of the symptoms? Is it different for everybody?
Yeah, probably you could probably even say that no two are exactly the same. And here's why, because when you take the immune system out, when you suppress the immune system, all of these dormant viruses and um, all of these dormant viruses reactivate. Each person has different kinds, right? Different combinations. Then also you are subjected to different opportunistic infections. What those are infections that normally wouldn't be a problem for somebody, but since they're immunosuppressed, it becomes a problem for them. And so these can be picked up in the environment and become a problem for you. Um, and because everybody is exposed in different ways, you're never going to have two that are exactly the same. So it creates a complex disease. Now, Lyme disease, for those who don't know, is from a spirochete. It's like a little worm. It looks like a little corkscrew worm. But what he did was modify them um, to take on all sorts of different properties, and it was from a bird Lyme disease, right? It was a spirochete that only affected birds and soft ticks, and what he did was adapted them to many new land animals, gave it broad spectrum zoonotic capabilities, also changed the vector. Instead of being transmitted by soft ticks, it is transmitted by the hard-bodied ticks, which are like Ixodes scapularis, which is like the black-legged tick. Those are a real nuisance to humans too in America. So back when, and I'll explain how this all unfolded. It was all under the guise of helping us, right? It was all done under the guise of biodefense practices that were meant to or supposed to help us. They were called simulant tests. Simulant Not as in coffee, a stimulant, simulant as in a simulation, right? Simulation tests. They were they would take bacteria that they say was harmless. They would spray it all over a city to see how it spreads out, or they would take bacteria that is supposed to be harmless and put it in insects and release the insects and say, okay, it's harmless. And apparently, he was telling them that it leaves a bullseye rash that's harmless, and that's how they track it, and that's how the Nazis tracked it. But basically, he was attacking us right under our noses, and so it was like all of these all of these biodefense practices under the guise of helping us actually hurting us. And this is still something that is going on today, that is, you know, all sorts of practices that they say are for our benefit but actually harm us. And I don't have to go too deeply into that. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, but um he was so these the Lyme disease is oftentimes you don't just get Lyme disease. Oftentimes you'll get a whole combination of different infections. You have so you have the spirochete, Borrelia burgdorferi. Then you have things like Babesia, um, Microti, Microtii, which is it's a blood parasite like malaria. Then you have things like Bartonella, which it's also a blood type of bacteria. It's a really nasty one. And you have things like Rickettsia and then Ehrlichia, which is so like five different infections all rolled into one, right? And it creates a very complex disease picture. Like a doctor seeing that would have absolutely no idea what is going on, you know, and the unusual nature of it, having five infections all rolled into one would be, even if they suspected bioterrorism, they probably wouldn't suspect that. You know what I mean?
And is this from the deer ticks? I remember when I was younger, they were calling Lyme disease from deer ticks.
Yeah. These are the black-legged ticks. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so at that time, when they began using those ticks in tests, like all the way up to 1949 and 1951, they were still saying that these ticks had absolutely no human diseases. They were saying, yep, it's a real nuisance, but they don't transmit any known human diseases. And that's the reason why they started using them. Because they're like, oh, what better tick to use for these tests since they don't transmit human diseases? But then when he infected them with this, I call it a Russian doll cocktail of infectious disease, they started to people started coming down with all sorts of health problems. You had like this MS, multiple sclerosis types of diseases. You had chronic diseases of all kinds. And there was a Lyme disease pioneer, one of the first cases. Her name was Polly Murray. She wrote a book called The Widening Circle, and she talks about how she got sick in the middle of in the middle of the 1950s. Then by the 1960s, she was fully debilitated by it. So this idea that it started in 1975 is actually a misnomer. It didn't actually start in 1975. What happened was in 1975, they decided to acknowledge that it was a disease, right? Because there was a cluster of cases in Connecticut, right over in Lyme, Connecticut, just a couple miles away from Plum Island. All these children were having it, and they actually may have gotten it through their mother. The mother may have got it and then transmitted it to the children. That's a possibility. Um, and they've documented this happening. And so at that time, they decided to acknowledge it. That's when they started to shine all the light on it. In Even in the 1950s, there was a German researcher named Gabriel Steiner who was finding spirochetes in MS patients. They made it this huge controversy, and then nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. So it's not surprising that happened. Um, but I have Erich Traub. Erich Traub is the German scientist that he's like the center of my book. He's the guy, right?
He's the one
Um,
who created this Lyme's
yeah, so
disease.
I have him in 1939. So he was over in the Rockefeller Institute in the 1930s,
Of
right?
course.
And then when World War II, he goes back in 1938, and then in 1939, that's the year when he learns all about these tick-borne diseases. That's the year I have him with the avian spirochete, the bird spirochete, through his student Werner Schaefer. I have them with the spirochete, and that same year, he's learning about all the same co-infections that later show up in the black-legged tick. The Bartonella, the Babesia, the Rickettsia, the Ehrlichia, all of these things, right? I mean, what a coincidence. So it was this German book, right? It was this German book. It's the Handbook for Virus Diseases. That's what it says in German. And in that book, he it was a chapter. So his mentor basically like his mentor, his name was Carl Beller, is teaching about all of these how a dog infected with all of these co-infections has this really complex disease. And all of those co-infections later show up in the black-legged tick, right? He's talking about how confusing it is to diagnose because the dog's infected with so many different infections. And he talked about how this combination of infections could induce immune tolerance. And now Erich Traub had already discovered immune tolerance by injecting a mouse's brain with foreign protein to see if he could reactivate a dormant virus from within the mouse, and he did. And he studied this condition and all the ways that he could induce it. And one of the ways he could induce it was by having this complex mix of infections, all of these infections all rolled into one. So that's like where I have him. 1939 was a big year. And so it was over in Germany first, like before it shows up in, near Plum Island and all of that. It actually was all over the United States through these tests that he was doing, but the Plum Island area is like a focal point. Um, so it's over there in Germany in World War II. He's testing it over Russia. He's testing it in Africa and different places. And then the Soviet Union takes over his lab in 1945. They captured his lab. It was like a German kind of Plum Island. It was called Insel Reims. It's at the very northern tip of Germany. And it's exactly like Plum Island. In fact, Plum Island was later set up based on his descriptions of this island, of that German facility. So the Soviet Union, they take his lab, they haul off his entire uh it was like a state of the art lab. It was like the most advanced lab or bioweapons lab on the planet at that time. They took it, they hauled it off to Russia. This was the Soviet Union, and then he was basically flipped to help them afterwards, because what they did was they would blackmail you. They would blackmail you with war crimes, right? And so you can work for us or, go to Nuremberg. And uh, British intelligence also helped him escape, but it was all like fake. Like it was all set up to happen. Like his escape from the Soviet controlled Insul Reams at that time was fake. It wasn't like they were letting him go because they had already got him to flip to their side, right? Like he wasn't escaping. They weren't going to let him escape. Like it was all set up because they wanted to send him to America to attack the United States. Also involved was British intelligence. And in the beginning of my book, I talked about how British intelligence were actually the pioneers of biological warfare. They're the ones who are using smallpox, like since I have George Washington on record saying, that the British are using smallpox against us.
Yeah,
So,
because they were giving the blankets, right, to the Native
right.
Americans. Yeah.
Yeah, they did it to the Native Americans and that, but
Hmm.
they also would inoculate people and send them over to the Continental Army to get them infected with smallpox. So it's yeah, and they were doing it also in Australia. They were doing the same thing to the Aborigines in Australia. British intelligence were doing this. And I mean, basically, also if they go all of those different places that they tried to conquer, India, Africa, Australia, all of these places, they would use a similar playbook. So
Mm.
another thing I'd like to point out is that the Soviet Union itself was more or less a puppet government of British intelligence. Like they were heavily involved in setting up the Soviet Union. They were, this was something that, I mean, I read several books where these Secret Service people were writing about setting up the Soviet Union. So I kind of see it as kind of like a monster that Britain created, and they use it as a go-between. Instead of them having to attack us directly, they go through the Soviet Union, have them attack us, like divide and conquer type of strategy. And I even think probably that Erich Traub may have been a British agent this entire time. He did go to England right before he gets into veterinary medicine. He was over in England, um, and so they probably recruited him. But yeah, when he came over here in America, and this was 1948, he was considered the world's like top expert on biological warfare preparations. They were saying in the file that there's nobody in America that matches his level of talent. Um, and like Willy Bergdorfer, he didn't have anywhere near the talent that Eric Traub had. That's why I think he kind of became like I think a lot of people tried to put the blame on him, but if you actually look at this and you really go through it, Willy Bergdorfer absolutely did not have the skills to put this together like Eric Traub did. Eric Traub was skilled in the art of adaptation. He would adapt, he was a veterinarian, right? Veterinarians made the best bioweaponeers because they understood zoonosis. Willy Bergdorfer was not, if I remember correctly, he wasn't a veterinarian, and he didn't have this diverse level of expertise that Eric Traub did, and he had never worked in biological warfare before he came over to America. Eric Traub had been doing it for years, right? And he was running facilities, vice president of bioweapons facilities.
Mm.
He was like, or like so many orders of magnitude above someone like Willy Bergdorfer in terms of talent. He could adapt things to new species when everybody else had failed at it. Like one of the things he did, he adapted this virus, foot and mouth disease virus, to chicken eggs when nobody else was successful. And the way he did this was he would mix 10 different strains of foot and mouth disease in one egg, and he would alternate passages between eggs and guinea pigs. And it was a very sophisticated system. Before the recombinant DNA technology was around, that's the way they bioengineered. They had these different animals that they would run things through. And if you did that, so certain animals gave it certain properties, for whatever reason, but that's a fact. That's not my opinion. And so he had very sophisticated methods, and he also liked to use viruses, and he would like to mix together a lot of different pathogens, because when you mix together pathogens like that, there's something called horizontal gene transfer, where genes from the other microbes also get exchanged with the others. So they start to evolve. Um, and even today with the recombinant DNA technology, I think they still like this old method. It's far more reliable. And then they can always blame it on nature. They say, "Oh, well, it came from this animal. It's closest to the virus in this animal. So it must have come from nature," even though they have these animals in a lab. Like gain of function research, what do? They pass things between ferrets and different animals, right? But then they say, "Oh, well, this came from a ferret, so it must be from nature." And it just makes the whole it just makes this whole lab versus natural origin completely irrelevant. Like, because if you have these animals in a lab, then there's no way to, so that's one of the games they play. And it's funny that anytime anybody talks about biological warfare, like one of us, they immediately call us conspiracy theorists, but then we have to pay millions or billions of dollars a year in taxes to protect against it. So who's crazy? You know what I mean? Like, you're going to tell us we're crazy, but we have to pay millions of dollars of taxes to protect against that? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. I think for now, we can really get into the depth of this on the plus side. I would like to get into more of the details that we can't talk about on the YouTube side. But for the plus side, you argue that the biological warfare evolved from weapons designed to kill quickly into weapons designed to weaken populations slowly. Could you talk a little
Okay,
bit
yeah,
about that? Yeah.
sure. So there's two kinds of biological weapons, those that
Mhm.
kill quickly, but the problem with those that kill quickly is that they tend to burn out fast. Like, so here's an example: Ebola virus. Ebola is something, it's very fatal, it's a very dangerous disease, but it localizes. It kills a bunch of people in one area, and then it fizzles out really quickly and doesn't keep going. So that was one of the problems they always had, is they could never keep these things going that were really fatal. On the other hand, the strategic biological weapons, these are ones that act very slowly, and they tire, exhaust, and overwhelm. It's a different strategy, and it's actually way more effective long term. And a lot of these agents, these tend to keep going. These don't burn out. These keep going, then keep filtering through populations. And having people alive, like keeping people alive, is actually it's actually in their favor. If you can hardly function, instead of, like, being buried or burned, people have to take care of these people because they're still alive, and they can't really contribute to society in the best way, and also their brain is affected. So this is what I call the dark triad of immune tolerance. So dark triad is a term they use for, like, psychopaths, right? And psychology. I came up with this idea for immune tolerance. whenever he would induce immune tolerance, there were three things that would happen: chronic disease, neuropsychiatric disorders, neurological disorders, and then cancers. So those three things are are something you can usually expect. They don't always happen at the same time. They don't always happen all three, but you get these that happen. So, and if you think about it, keeping people alive, but they're complete mental cases, or have all these mental problems, that also puts a big strain on society. And then you look at like the headlines today of people doing just absolute insane stuff every day, brutal, senseless murders, things like that. So a lot of these agents are neurotropic. They attack the brain. Neurotropic. Tropic means like takes the way of. So neurotropic takes the way of the brain. Um, and so anytime he would take out the immune system, all of these viruses that were in the brain already would reactivate, and a lot of the agents he engineered were also neurotropic. And so that's like a big part of this. And these things aren't going away. And every year it seems like it's almost like this snowball effect. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So you can see the evil genius of this kind of weapon, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing. And I even thought about it like just looking back, like my whole life makes sense. And it's like how like in the 80s people were a lot more angry and stuff. I know it's like the rise of heavy metal. I mean, I love heavy metal, but it makes a lot of sense to me because it's like people are angry, they need some kind of outlet, so the music would continue to become angrier. Then you had like the gangster rap and stuff, just very, because people are having a hard time and they can't really put their, I mean, there's other factors involved, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people are struggling without knowing that there's this hidden enemy that's been proliferating our the human species since these you know big events back in the 50s. Um, so
How
really,
much, I was
go
going to
ahead.
ask, how much of the population do you think this has affected? Do you
I
have an
would say,
idea?
I would say um, almost everybody. I would say everybody is affected in some way.
Wow.
Here's the reason why not everybody is as affected as others. There's something called HLA. It stands for human leukocyte antigen. Everybody has a different immune system. The HLA is like it's like how blood types, you have different blood types, right? Well, you have different immune system types as well. Some people, it's the reason why some people will have a fatal reaction to certain viruses, while other people are just totally unaffected by it. They have different immune systems, they have different HLA susceptibilities. So it's kind of like this genetic thing. Um, and don't get me wrong, like, food, nutrition, all that plays into your terrain, but there's also, certain types of immune systems that when they're exposed to certain things, either, go haywire or they're unaffected. That's the reason. And yeah, I would say everybody is affected, especially with some of the things that we've been doing to um
I mean, vaccines, we can say it now.
okay, yeah, exactly, yeah. So that I'd say that more than anything else is probably even that's probably like the biggest factor, because so all of these things contain these little antigens. Those same antigens are what Erich Traub was putting on a lot of these agents to cause this. So if you're going to inject it, it doesn't make any difference whether you get it from a tick or you get it by injecting it into you. It has the same effect. And why are they doing this is I've come to the conclusion that our public health system has been infiltrated and taken over from a very long time, from a very early time, and is now so bad that it's actually being used as a weapon against us rather than trying to help us. It absolutely makes no sense to give these kids like 90 injections by the time they're, I mean that's just absolutely insane to me that people think that's not going to cause harm. Like it's not a harmless process. Producing antibodies, yeah, it's not actually a harmless process. What it is it's burning your immune system out every time. And a lot of these nasty antigens will bring on this immune tolerance. And so that's one of the big problems. And so I actually had a Hep B vaccine injury when I was in high school. And I didn't know this until I was researching for my book within, probably like 2018 or something.
Wow.
There was a congressional hearing on the Hep B vaccine, and it was called something like hurting or helping public health. And there were all of these parents that were talking about how their child got all of these neurological diseases, all these neurological problems, ADHD, ADD, anxiety disorders, you name it, right? And I was like, oh, that's what happened to me, because in high school, I had the same thing going on. And then, and I had behavioral health problems. I got kicked out of two high schools for like fighting and stuff. And it made so much sense when I started to look at it in hindsight. I was like, well, my whole life started to make sense after I understood how this stuff works because it's that proliferative. Like it's affecting that many people. It's affecting everybody. So it's a major problem.
Is there a cure for this? Is there some way that you can relieve some of the symptoms, maybe?
Well, there's different stuff. There's different ways you could approach this. Some people, I know I believe in the power of fasting.
Okay.
It's just not very easy to do.
Mhm.
But there are people who have had really good results with like dry fasting. That's even fasting without even water, and also water fasting. There are other fasts you can do. I mean, there's something called the Master Cleanse fast that you could do. It's like it's a lot easier than water fasting, where you have like it's like two tablespoons of maple syrup, organic maple
Mm.
syrup, and then like you squeeze lemon juice into it and
Mm-hmm.
cayenne pepper. I did that for 10 days once. I had more energy than I've ever had in my life. Um, but it's fasting is hard. But on the other hand, there is somebody that I'm friends with who's doing some excellent work out of Japan. His name is Kevin McCairn. Um, McCairn. Kevin McCairn. He's doing something called plasmapheresis. He works at a hospital in Japan. He's very active on Twitter or X, and he's actually been reversing some of these vaccine injuries, at least so far. Like he still has to monitor how people are doing for quite a while, but right now he's having some really fantastic results. I know my friend Lindsay House just went there and had that done, and she says she feels, I mean, and she looks like amazing. She, from the before and after, she looked really sick, and then after, she looks so healthy. Um, that's one thing that I think is that gives me hope. And personally, I think Big Pharma should pay for it and allow everybody to get it and then be sent to prison. But there are things that can be done. It's just that our system is set up so that they don't allow these things. Like even dealing with disease, people think that um, vaccines are the only way to deal with disease, that they're the only way to prevent disease, and that's not true. Like there's so many different things you could do. There's so many different ways you could attack this. It's just they don't allow for innovation with the way things are set up. It's a bureaucracy. I mean, you see the stuff with Anthony Fauci coming out, all of that stuff, and they're basically saying the whole system is just this big bureaucracy, and they don't allow for innovation. They don't, they don't let anybody explore different things. They want these vaccines. They want you taking these vaccines, and I think there's a darker agenda involved.
But
But
don't these people think that, I mean, if they're giving us not only the injections, but if they're releasing these vectors out there in the wild, don't these elite people think that they may catch it or their loved ones will get it? Or do they have an antidote themselves, you think, so they can't, so they're
that's a
immune
good,
to this?
it's a good question. But basically, from what I've seen is, I mean, a lot of them like for example Eric Traub and a lot of the people he was working with, they didn't seem to care. I mean, they just seemed so wrapped up in what they were doing, they didn't even think of the consequences. I mean,
Mhm.
because that's one argument is that, aren't they afraid that it'll come back to them? Well, it's kind of like
Mhm.
nuclear weapons where they're building these nuclear weapons, and like who in their right mind would even consider trying to build that stuff? You know what I mean? But they do it. They still do it and they go all out into it. I mean, there are people in the nuclear weapons development thing that there were plenty of people that died because not only were they were mixing all of these radioactive materials together, they didn't even have a suit on to do it. Like so
Oh my God.
there's people in our system from the past that have died these horrible deaths because they were exposed to radiation that something went wrong when they were creating nuclear weapons and they died a horrible death that could have been avoided if they had just put a suit on. Okay? And there's multiple people that did this. So this is kind of like the mentality. I mean, this is the kind of stuff we're dealing with. There's people that are just absolutely it's insanity. But they're so wrapped up in what they're doing. And there's other people like Ken Alabek, the Soviet bioweaponeer, and he talked about some of the like if you read a book like that, he wrote a book called Biohazard. It was about him running this huge bioweapons program where they were just cooking up tons of anthrax and all these fatal diseases, and you can kind of get a glimpse into how these people think. Like they didn't think twice about doing this. It was like, I mean, you could get into different theories about why that is, but they did it. Like they went all into it and they didn't think of the consequences. A lot of them got sick. And yeah, there was some times where, like I was saying with the nuclear stuff, somebody instead of wearing the right suit would just, not wear anything and he'd jab himself with Marburg virus and die a horrible death from Marburg virus, all because he didn't even want to wear the right proper uh safety gear. You know what I mean?
That's crazy.
It's-
Your book discusses Operation Paperclip.
mm,
What connections do you find between the former Nazi scientists and the later biological warfare research program? Are they connected?
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So Erich Traub, he was like probably the most skilled bioweaponeer on the planet. That's why every country wanted him. But he basically advised us on how to run a biological warfare program. So all of our biodefense practices actually come from the Nazis. Basically we were advised by Nazis like Erich Traub, among others, on how to run. That's where we got that whole simulant testing idea from. They were they were doing the simulant testing since the 1930s. German intelligence. They were going into the subways of Paris and London, and they would release these bacteria called Serratia marcescens that was supposed to be harmless. But in my book, I showed how Erich Traub had actually weaponized that bacteria in 1940 with a virus. What he did was, so Serratia marcescens, given that it's considered harmless, they often use it in these filtration tests. So if there's a sample that infects a cow or infects something, and they're not sure if it's a bacteria or a virus, what they do is they run it through this filter. If it passes through the filters, it's not a bacteria. Then they consider it a virus. But if it's held back, by the filters, and that's what causes the disease, okay, it's a bacteria. Well, what happened was he would have the Serratia marcescens uh, and run this virus through it, and it's held back by the bacteria is held back, and he found that that viral genetic material could be transferred to the bacteria that was considered harmless and then be able to cause disease. So he weaponized that bacteria, and then later on he's telling us to spray it all over the place in these open air tests. What they did was that from San Francisco, they would release a fog over this from the shore over San Francisco, and then all these people started coming down with these nasty infections of this bacteria that they had never seen before create human infections. So stuff like that. Also, the insect simulant tests came from him. A lot of these things. So it's very we're actually kind of dumb. I mean, we got all our information, we got all our ideas from them. We got all our ideas from them, um, and the reason the Soviet Union became so advanced as well is because they are the ones who got his entire lab. They're the ones who were able to steal the state-of-the-art facility. So they kind of took the lead in it. Um, and of course, like I said before, British intelligence was very all wrapped up in the Soviet Union, so it's kind of like a monster they created. But all of our biodefense practices and all of they're the ones who just want to continue giving us vaccine after vaccine after vaccine without even considering how it's affecting us. I mean, with the level of neurological diseases we have, and they're not even considering that it might be related, it kind of speaks to something more sinister, in my opinion, you know? Um, and but this is also going on on the chemical side. So the chemical warfare is also a thing, and one of the ways they can wage chemical warfare is by putting all these chemicals in our food, putting all these chemicals in the products we use, all sorts of stuff like that. So, I mean, if you think about it, there's three kinds of weapons. There's the nuclear or electromagnetic types of weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons. Those are the three. They call it CBE, I think. It's chemical, biological, CBN, chemical, biological, nuclear. But the nuclear also includes all of the less the radioactive frequencies and the electromagnetic frequency weapons, all stuff like that.
So, so they want to get us guaranteed no matter which way we are going to get affected by this.
Yeah, and there's a synergy. There's like a synergy that occurs between the three. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, I hate to say it, we're getting blasted by like from every angle. Um, but that's what's happening, and I hope that we can turn this around. It's just that people need to understand what is going on first. I said by the end of my book, the first step in solving any problem is actually knowing what the problem is, right? That's why I
Yes.
think people knowing about this, as dark and as unfriendly as it is to learn about, the more people know about it, the less it can continue onward under the guise of something helpful. Um, but yeah, that's what I
Well,
see. And by the end of my book, oh, here's another interesting thing. The guy who approved, the man who, I talked about a guy in my book named MP Chumakov. He was this hardcore Stalinist bioweaponeer. He tested on the Muslims and Mongolians in Siberia. He also teamed up with Albert Sabin, our one of our public health people, to make the oral polio vaccine, even though they were our enemies, and the FBI cleared it. That vaccine was tainted by the SV40, just like Jonas Salk's was, and Jonas Salk also worked with him to some degree. But that guy's son, MP Chumakov's son, Konstantin Chumakov, was able to come over here while the Soviet Union was still in power. They allowed him to come over here, and Albert Sabin got him a job at NIH or NIAID, which is the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. By 2019, he was running vaccine safety and review at the FDA, and he's the one who approved the COVID vaccine. And that,
unreal.
so his father, I talk about a lot in my book. And that guy is the one who approved this. So it's not surprising. It's not surprising to
Not
me.
surprising. They all have the same end game. It doesn't matter if it's from our enemies, from us. They all have the same end game. They want to
Mm.
kill us off.
Yeah, 6 out of 7 people. They want 6 out of 7
Oh
people
my
gone.
God. That's
I know
awful.
it is awful. That's just it's definitely it's the way they think. I mean, personally, me, I think even though I keep a lot of my personal beliefs out of the book, I just I believe there's forces of evil out there that beyond just human, but spiritual
Mm-hmm.
beings, spiritual
Yep.
entities that were created before our
Mm-hmm.
race, and that they're kind of fell by the wayside.
Yep. I agree. I agree. And everything that you've learned, what practical steps do you think we can take to better protect our health? I mean, is there something that we can do?
Well, given that we're kind of being hit from every angle, I mean, I think
Yes.
because for me, it's like I don't walk around being afraid of everything. You know what I mean?
Mm,
Like
of course.
I don't think it's useful to spend a lot of time fearing everything. I mean,
Mm,
we're all gonna die eventually, regardless if they're coming at us or not. The best, I think the best piece of advice is to try to live your life to the best that you can, to live the fullest life that you can while you're here, because we already have a temporary life anyway, right? So, and I think part of the reason we come here is to evolve. I think part of the reason we come here is to learn how to manifest the divine within us. And I think that's something that we have to think about. That's something, we have a certain amount of power and over our life. We don't always have a say in what happens and everything, but we have a say in how we react, and we have a say in how we conduct ourselves. And I think, like for me, I love BMX biking. I like music. I like all of those things that give my life meaning is what I try to put my time and energy and focus into, right? And that's kind of like, obviously try to be smart about things if you can protect yourself in some way, like, by using, like a essential oil spray to keep ticks off you and do that, or, things, all sorts of different things you could do. But the thing that I wouldn't do is just walk around dwelling on it and fearing every possible threat, because every time we go outside, there's a threat that we could die in some way, but it's not really worth dwelling on. Just try to be smart, live your life to the best of your ability, and try to have the best life that you can.
yeah, I agree. Amen. Yep.
Mm.
Well, Adam, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and share your research with us today. I mean, it's clearly a subject that you've spent years investigating, and you've certainly given us a lot to think about. So I appreciate you sharing both your personal journey and the research that led you to write The Sleeper Agent. But before we go, where can listeners find your book and follow your work?
Yeah, so I think I do have a website, thesleeperagent.com, but I think the better place to go is Substack, at AW Finnegan, Finnegan, AW Finnegan. At AW Finnegan is where I'm at on Substack. You could also find me with the same handle on X. You can also find me with the same handle on YouTube. Um, are there any others? Oh, Facebook. I'm on Facebook. But on the sleeperagent.com, I do have like links to all those social media as well. So I guess
Awesome.
thesleeperagent.com, you go there and you'll find it.
Well, thank you so much, Adam,
Mm,
for being here today. Really appreciate this. It was a amazing conversation. I really enjoyed it.
definitely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys, for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Ahui ho kako.